When a grieving widow ventures into her attic, she believes she is merely decluttering the remnants of a life once shared. But as she carefully lifts an old army footlocker from the shadows, one small envelope catches her eye. Inside is a photograph that unravels everything she thought she knew about her late husband. A secret love from a war-torn land, a piece of him she never glimpsed. Before we begin this deeply emotional journey of buried pasts, hidden heartbreak, and the courage to bridge years of separation, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe in the power of truth to mend even the deepest wounds, give this video a like and subscribe for more stories that reveal the unspoken bonds that shape our lives. She found the picture on a Tuesday. Gray light streamed through the attic window, illuminating swirls of dust motes. Joyce was tired, physically, of course, from climbing and sorting boxes, but also emotionally, from the weeks of widowhood that had stretched on without Henry. He had passed only a month prior, but in that time Joyce had learned that grief was relentless, pressing in from all sides and lingering in the quiet corners of the house. Henry's old army footlocker was a relic she had largely ignored. They had been married nearly 43 years, and in all that time Henry never spoke much about his time in Vietnam. He would mention the heat, the confusion, the swirl of a war zone, but the details always stopped short. Now, rifling through his faded uniforms and medals, she found an envelope. Unassuming, yellowed at the edges, clearly old. When she opened it, her world shifted in an instant. The first photograph was of a young Vietnamese girl with gentle eyes and long black hair, wearing a floral áo dai. On the back, in Henry's handwriting, was the name Lynn. Joyce's pulse fluttered. She didn't recall Henry ever mentioning such a person. The second photograph in the envelope made her gasp. It was the original shot of Henry at 20, shirtless and grinning. A photo that Joyce recognized from their living room mantel. But in that publicly displayed version, the edges had been cropped. Here she could see the entire frame. On Henry's shoulder was a tattoo, Lynn. Joyce stared at that name, the swirl of black ink etched forever into her husband's skin. All those years, he'd told her it was something silly, just a drunken dare. He never hinted at a Vietnamese woman. He never spoke of her at all. She sat on the attic floor, heart pounding, the stale smell of cardboard and old linens drifting around her. She felt betrayed, as though Henry had lied to her for their entire marriage. The swirl of anger rose unexpectedly, battling with the grief that had been her constant companion. She tried to rationalize. Everyone had a past, especially those who went to war. But the deception cut deep. Why had he hidden it for so many years? She noticed something else at the bottom of the footlocker. A battered notebook. She flipped through the pages, scanning Henry's distinctive scrawl. At the back was a folded letter, never sent. Lynn, I tried to find you. They said you were gone. Every day I wish I'd stayed. The tears came then, hot and burning. She closed her eyes, hugging the letter to her chest, grappling with the reality that Henry had once loved someone else. Or perhaps he'd always loved this woman in some small corner of his heart. Joyce did not know which possibility felt worse. Confusion overwhelmed her. She thought she knew Henry better than anyone. Yet here was evidence of an entire life he had hidden. She couldn't process it alone. She trudged downstairs, carried the envelope, photos, and letter to the kitchen, and stood there trembling. The house was far too silent. She glanced at the phone, wishing Henry were there for her to confront, to demand answers, to cry or scream or do both. But he was gone. The finality of it gnawed at her. In the following days, she struggled with whether or not to investigate further. Part of her yearned to let it remain in the past. Henry was gone. Why unearth secrets that might only bring heartache? Yet the unanswered questions haunted her. She needed to know why Henry kept this part of his life hidden. More than that, she felt compelled to do right by him, even if it meant facing uncomfortable truths. She called her niece, Olivia, who was Henry's brother's daughter. Olivia was in her late 20s, bright, and spoke fluent Vietnamese thanks to years of studying abroad and a stint working for a community outreach program. Joyce explained only that she needed help translating some letters from Henry's time in Vietnam. Olivia agreed immediately, offering warmth and understanding. They arranged for Olivia to visit. Joyce found herself fidgeting in the living room the day Olivia arrived. The younger woman walked in with a gentle smile, hugging Joyce. "Auntie, how are you holding up?" Joyce sighed, tears threatening. "I'm managing. Thank you for coming." They sat at the kitchen table. Joyce carefully laid out the photos, the envelope, and the battered notebook. She explained as best she could, her words halting, about Henry's apparent relationship with a Vietnamese woman named Lynn. She watched Olivia's face shift from shock to intrigue to sympathy. "Do you think Henry had a child?" Joyce asked, her voice trembling. "This photo looks like a young girl, but it could be 10 or older. Henry's letter mentions searching for her, or for the mother. I can't tell." Olivia nodded, scanning the letter. She carefully read the Vietnamese words Henry had written or copied. "Auntie, some of this is definitely Henry's writing in Vietnamese, but the grammar is rough. Another chunk of it seems to be someone else's handwriting, possibly Lynn's mother. These look like addresses, maybe references to refugee programs." Her brow furrowed. "It's going to take some time to translate thoroughly." They spent the next few hours dissecting the documents. Some were half-legible. Others included references to an evacuation, mention of an embassy, and a last letter to "my love," which Henry never sent. The contents hinted at a love story cut short, at bureaucratic red tape, at the confusion of war. Joyce felt her heart twist as she pictured Henry, so young, trying desperately to hold on to someone he cared about. Was that the reason for the tattoo, an indelible marker of that love? Olivia paused, finger tracing the Vietnamese characters. "This letter mentions a child. It says, 'If something happens to me, tell my daughter.' Then it trails off. The rest is smudged. But there's definitely mention of a daughter." Joyce inhaled sharply. "So Henry fathered a child in Vietnam? That would mean... Oh God, that would mean Elaine has a sister she's never known." Elaine was Joyce and Henry's only child, now grown with a family of her own. Joyce felt the weight of it settling on her shoulders. Not only did she have to accept Henry's secret, but she would potentially be forced to share it with Elaine. How would her daughter react? For days after, Joyce's mind churned with questions. She found it difficult to focus on her everyday tasks. Even the simplest acts, watering the plants, sorting the mail, felt meaningless while this heavy truth hovered in the background. She confided in Olivia that she wasn't sure she wanted to open old wounds. But Olivia gently encouraged her, insisting that Henry's secret had a right to come to light, that perhaps someone out there had spent decades wondering what became of him. Joyce tried to forget it, but she couldn't. Eventually, she agreed to start searching for Lynn, or for any record of Henry's time in Vietnam that might reveal the truth. Together, she and Olivia combed through old archives, used genealogical websites, and even tried connecting with humanitarian organizations dedicated to reuniting families separated by the war. The process was exhaustive and complicated. Most records were incomplete, many destroyed or never digitized. They encountered lead after lead that fizzled into nothing. Yet every night, Joyce lay awake, Henry's face filling her thoughts. She remembered the day they met, how he'd made her laugh by pretending to trip over his shoelaces. She recalled their wedding day, how he'd been so nervous that he put his shoes on the wrong feet. All their years of marriage, the quiet evenings, the family dinners, the vacations with Elaine. She tried to reconcile that version of Henry with the young man in the photograph, arms wrapped around a Vietnamese woman. She found it impossible not to feel betrayed. At one point, she considered discarding the search, returning to her previous, simpler memories. But something deeper compelled her. Maybe it was her sense of justice, or a desire to fulfill Henry's unspoken wish. Or maybe she just needed closure. So she pressed on. Weeks turned into months. Olivia posted discreet queries in Vietnamese language forums, asking if anyone recognized the name Lynn or the details in Henry's letters. Most responses were sympathetic but unhelpful. Then, late one evening, Olivia called Joyce, her voice alight with excitement. "Auntie," she said, sounding breathless, "I think I found her, or at least someone who might be her." There's a Lynn in a Vietnamese-American community in Fresno, California, who posted a photo that looks, well, I swear it's the same face as that little girl in your old picture, just older. Joyce's stomach flipped. She hurried to her laptop, opened the link Olivia sent, and gazed at the image of an older woman with kind eyes, wearing a simple blouse, standing in front of a small garden. There was a quiet dignity in her expression. The photo was posted on a forum discussing family reunification. Lynn had mentioned searching for any information about American connections from long ago. Joyce felt an odd surge of relief, excitement, and dread all at once. If this was truly Henry's daughter, what would that mean for Joyce's own family? For Elaine? For the memory of Henry, who had apparently lived a double life in some sense. In the days that followed, Olivia reached out to Lynn through private messages, trying to confirm details. Lynn responded cautiously. She provided a few scraps of information, saying her father had been an American soldier, but she believed he died in the late stages of the war. She had only hazy childhood memories. He was tall, he laughed a lot, and he had a tattoo of her mother's name. As soon as Olivia read that, she and Joyce felt their suspicions harden into near certainty. This had to be Henry's daughter. Joyce realized she couldn't merely remain behind a computer screen. She wanted, or perhaps needed, to meet this woman in person. The idea terrified her. She imagined arriving unannounced, explaining she was the widow of the father Lynn never knew. The father who, from Lynn's perspective, had been dead for decades. She rehearsed the conversation in her head, but it always devolved into tears. Still, the compulsion to see her face to face outweighed the fear. With Olivia's help, Joyce made travel arrangements. She booked a flight to California, told Elaine she needed a personal trip to settle matters related to Henry's estate, an excuse that was partly true but not entirely. She lacked the courage to tell her daughter the real reason. Not yet. First, she had to know for certain. When the plane touched down in Fresno, Joyce's heart hammered in her chest. She rented a small car, checked into a motel, and tried to gather her nerves. The next afternoon, she found the address Lynn had shared. It was in a modest neighborhood, rows of single-story homes with small yards, children's bicycles lying on driveways, potted plants adorning porches. Joyce drove past it once, then circled back and parked across the street. She sat there for a long time, staring at the house, working up the courage to knock. Eventually, the door opened, and a woman stepped onto the porch, scanning the street as if sensing a presence. Joyce recognized her immediately, the older Lynn from the photo. Even across the distance, Joyce could see the glimmer of Henry's features in her eyes. The set of her jaw tore at Joyce's heart. She felt guilty, protective, and frightened all at once. She exited the car, noticing how her knees felt weak. As she approached, Lynn eyed her with polite curiosity. "Hello," Lynn said in lightly accented English, offering a wary smile. "Can I help you?" Joyce swallowed, the words tangling in her throat. My name is Joyce. I believe you might be... Well, I believe my late husband was your father." Lynn's expression froze, confusion flickering. "I'm sorry? My father died during the war. At least, that's what I was told." Joyce forced a shaky breath, producing from her purse the photograph. Henry at 20, with Lynn's name tattooed on his shoulder. "I'm sorry to come like this, but I had to. I only discovered this recently." She extended the photograph. The moment Lynn's gaze landed on the tattoo, her eyes widened. Tears immediately welled. "That's impossible," she whispered. "But that's the same tattoo my mother used to talk about." Her voice trembled. "They told me he died." In that moment, Joyce felt compassion overshadow the confusion and anger she'd carried. She saw the pain in Lynn's face and recognized a longing that had festered for decades. Henry had been Lynn's father, yet she believed him gone. They both stood there on the porch, tears streaming silently. Lynn invited Joyce inside. The house was tidy, filled with subtle cultural touches, beautiful Vietnamese paintings on the walls, a small shrine with incense sticks. Joyce followed Lynn to the living room, every step feeling surreal. She sat on a couch, hands trembling in her lap. What happened?" Lynn asked softly once they were seated. "How can this be? My mother said he was taken away. Then someone told her he died, and she never heard from him again." Joyce shook her head, struggling to find the right words. "I only know bits and pieces. Henry, that was my husband. He had these letters, pictures. He apparently tried to find you after the war. Something went wrong. I'm sorry. There's so much I don't understand myself." Lynn stared at the photograph, silent tears dropping onto the couch cushions. "They were in love," she said after a pause. "My mother told me that. But everything happened so fast. When the city fell, we were separated. She was arrested under suspicion of aiding Americans. I ended up in a camp. Later, I was sent to another relative. They told me my father died. I didn't question it. How could I? I was so young." Joyce felt her heart twist. She reached out, placing a tentative hand on Lynn's arm. "Henry died just a month ago. He and I were married for many years. He never told me about you or your mother or that part of his life. I think it pained him too much to speak of it." Lynn wiped her eyes. "So he had another life here, another family. Did he have any children besides me?" She managed a weak smile. Joyce nodded, voice faltering. "A daughter, Elaine. She's your half-sister, I suppose." The statement felt strange on her tongue, but it was the truth. They talked for hours, exchanging what little they knew. Lynn told Joyce of her childhood in Vietnam, the hardships, the quiet longing for a father she believed gone. She recounted how she emigrated to the United States after many years, forging a life in California. Joyce shared her story with Henry, how they met, married, raised a daughter. Neither woman knew how to reconcile these overlapping timelines. At one point, Lynn left the room and returned with a small box of her own. Inside was a letter she had kept hidden, addressed to her. "My aunt gave this to me much later, and it was never delivered. My mother wrote my father's name on the outside, but it also had a note for me. It's mostly water damaged, but there's a line that says, 'If anything happens to me, know you're the one part of the war I never regretted. Your husband's name is on it, Henry.' I always thought it was just a memory, or that maybe it was for a different man. I didn't dare hope it was real." They read the fragments together, tears flowing. In that moment, Joyce sensed Henry's presence. The sweet, gentle man she had known, now layered with the longing, guilt, and heartbreak that had apparently defined him long before she met him. She realized that she wasn't the only one who lost Henry. Lynn had effectively lost him decades ago, before she ever truly knew him. They parted with tentative promises to stay in touch, but also with the recognition that this new relationship was fraught with complexities. Lynn had a life here, grown children of her own, responsibilities. Joyce needed to return home, but she carried a profound sense of obligation to share this revelation with Elaine. On the flight back, Joyce's mind spun with unanswerable questions. Would Elaine be furious at Henry for hiding this? Would she resent Joyce for uncovering it now, so soon after Henry's death? Or would she embrace the possibility of a sister with open arms? Joyce could only guess. When she finally gathered the courage to call Elaine and ask her to come over, she felt as nervous as she had on her wedding day. Elaine arrived at the house with her own teenage son in tow, expecting perhaps a discussion about Henry's estate. Instead, Joyce sat her down on the living room couch, produced the photographs and letters. As Elaine skimmed them, her expression shifted from confusion to shock to a kind of wounded acceptance. She asked questions that Joyce couldn't fully answer. She cried, then got angry, then grew quiet. Finally, Elaine murmured, "Dad did this out of love, didn't he? Maybe he felt guilty, or thought it was too late to fix it. I just wish he'd told us. We deserved to know. And what about that poor woman? Or my half-sister? Where is she now?" Joyce explained the entire journey. The searches, the frustration, the eventual discovery of Lynn in Fresno, their tearful meeting. Elaine listened intently. The teenage grandson hovered near the doorway, evidently enthralled by this revelation about his grandfather. "So," Elaine said at last, pressing her palm against her forehead, "I have a sister I never met, thanks to a war half a world away. Joyce nodded. If you'd like to speak with her, we can arrange that. But I understand if you need time. This is a lot. Elaine let out a trembling breath. I think I want to talk to her. I feel like Dad deserves that. She gave a small, sad smile. Strange how he's gone. Yet he's still weaving these unexpected connections in our lives. They decided to reach out over a video call, bridging the distance. The first conversation between Elaine and Lynn was awkward, full of halting attempts at forging a bond that was decades overdue. They stumbled over questions about families, about who had known what, about Henry's timeline. Yet beneath the uncertainty was a growing sense of kinship. The two women realized they shared certain gestures, certain ways of tilting their heads, and, ironically, a few personality traits reminiscent of Henry. Their calls became more frequent. Over time, a cautious warmth formed. Lynn's adult son and daughter showed up in the background, curious about their newfound relatives. Elaine's teenage children giggled shyly, fascinated by the idea of having cousins they never knew existed. Joyce watched it unfold from the sidelines, torn between gratitude that Henry's secret was finally out and sorrow that Henry himself never got to witness these reunions. Months later, Lynn decided to visit. She arrived with her grown daughter, Mai, both a bit nervous about stepping into Henry's old home, the place Joyce still occupied with memories. When they stepped through the door, Joyce felt her heart pound. She offered them tea, her hands shaking slightly. Elaine arrived soon after, hugging Lynn tentatively but warmly. The two half-sisters observed each other closely, as if trying to piece together the family resemblances that time had nearly erased. They spent days talking, sharing photo albums, bridging the decades. Lynn asked questions about Henry, what foods he liked, what books he read, whether he was a good father to Elaine. Elaine asked about Lynn's experiences in Vietnam, how she managed to emigrate, how she raised her own children without her father's support. There were tears, laughter, and the occasional tense moment when someone realized a question had no easy answer. Joyce sensed that, in a way, they were all healing from the war's aftermath. Henry's deception had been rooted not in cruelty, but in heartbreak and fear. He had locked away that part of his life, perhaps to spare himself or others pain, not realizing that secrets always find a way to surface. Now, there was an odd beauty in seeing Elaine and Lynn bond over their father's memory, forging a relationship that transcended the boundaries of time and circumstance. One evening, Lynn asked to see Henry's old army footlocker. They all went up to the attic, stepping carefully amid boxes. Joyce opened the footlocker, revealing the neatly folded uniforms, the medals. Lynn ran her fingers over the fabric, tears glistening in her eyes. Mai snapped a few photos with her phone, saying she wanted to preserve this piece of their family history. Elaine knelt beside Lynn, offering comfort. On the final night of Lynn's visit, they prepared a large family dinner. Joyce tried her hand at cooking some Vietnamese dishes with Lynn's guidance, mixing them with the comfort foods that Elaine had grown up with. The house buzzed with conversation. For a moment, Joyce imagined Henry in the corner, smiling that gentle smile, seeing the family he had unwittingly brought together. She felt a pang of sadness that he would never meet Lynn face to face, never know the children he fathered in secret. But she also felt a sense of peace. After dinner, Lynn presented Joyce with a photograph she had found among her mother's old belongings. It was a slightly blurry shot of Henry, younger than Joyce had ever seen him, standing near a field in Vietnam, arms around Lynn's mother. They looked impossibly happy, as if the war raging around them was momentarily forgotten. Lynn told Joyce she wanted her to have it, so they could place it alongside the pictures of Henry's later life. Joyce's eyes filled with tears as she accepted it. "We'll honor them both," Joyce said softly. All parts of Henry's story. In the weeks after Lynn's departure, Joyce decided to frame 3 photos. The original uncropped photo of Henry's tattoo, the picture of Lynn as a child, and a snapshot they had taken during Lynn's visit, showing Lynn, Elaine, and their children together. She placed them on a small table near the mantel, a display of acceptance and unity. She no longer felt anger toward Henry. Instead, she felt a deep empathy for the young man he had once been, caught in the chaos of war, trying to preserve a love that he feared would be drowned out by the conflict. He hadn't hidden that past out of cruelty. He had done it out of the very human desire to protect himself and those he loved. The months that followed brought more connections. Lynn called often, sometimes to chat about everyday life in Fresno, sometimes to dig for more information about Henry's early years. Elaine reciprocated, inviting Lynn's family to a holiday gathering. Though they lived miles apart, their families began to intertwine, forging new traditions. Mai, Lynn's daughter, planned to attend a college near Elaine's hometown. Elaine's teenage son asked to visit Lynn's children in California over the summer break. Joyce observed it all, sometimes awash in sorrow that Henry missed this harmony, but mostly grateful. She saw, in a tangible way, how secrets can lead to heartbreak, but can also inspire growth and reconciliation when finally revealed. She discovered that the memory of Henry was not diminished by the knowledge of Lynn. Instead, it was expanded, made more profound by understanding the full scope of who he was and what he had experienced. One early spring evening, Joyce found herself alone in the living room, gazing at the framed photos. She reached out and gently ran her fingers over Henry's face in the uncropped picture. "We did it," she whispered, tears gathering. "Your family is together now, Henry. We're all here." She thought about how, in a different timeline, Henry and Lynn's mother might have escaped Vietnam together, might have raised Lynn in a safe place, might have built a life. She wondered if Henry would have ever come back home to the United States, or if she and Henry would have met at all. The complexity of fate astounded her. She felt a twinge of regret at the idea that if Henry had lived that life, she would have never known him. Life was a tapestry of near misses and heartbreaks, but it was also an ever-evolving story. Now, a new chapter had begun, shaped by Henry's silent wish for reconciliation. Joyce slept better after that. The nightmares of Henry's betrayal had eased, replaced by acceptance. She realized that love could be complicated, that one heart could hold multiple truths. Henry had been a good husband to her and a loving father to Elaine. He had also been someone else's love, father to another child, a man burdened by the horrors of war and the guilt of survival. Both versions of him were real, and both deserved to be remembered. Elaine, for her part, found her own sense of peace. She spoke to Joyce about it one day over tea, explaining that at first, she had felt a stab of jealousy and betrayal. But over time, she recognized that Henry's choices had been constrained by unimaginable pressures. They wept together, mother and daughter, letting go of resentments. Elaine told Joyce she planned to visit Lynn again soon, bringing her children so they could spend more time with their new cousins. Eventually, Henry's brother, Olivia's father, also got involved, curious to meet Lynn, since she was, biologically, part of his extended family. The circle of acceptance widened. Joyce witnessed a ripple effect, old wounds healing not just for Lynn and Henry's immediate descendants, but for others who had been touched by the echoes of the war. Memories and guilt that Henry and perhaps his brother had carried for years were now aired out, replaced by a sense of collective healing. 1 year after Joyce's first trip to Fresno, Lynn's entire family flew out to join them for a memorial service in Henry's honor. They held it in the local park, a casual affair with a short speech by Elaine and a table displaying photos of Henry, from his days in the army to his years as a husband and father. Joyce insisted on including the Vietnamese photograph of Henry and Lynn's mother. Lynn stood quietly beside it, tears brimming in her eyes. She said a few words in Vietnamese, a kind of blessing for Henry's spirit, wishing him peace. Then Elaine spoke, sharing how she had come to see her father in a new light, a man who loved deeply but had run out of time and words to share that love fully with both families. After the brief ceremony, they all shared a meal, exchanging memories. Joyce overheard Mai telling Elaine's teenage son about the times Henry had carried Lynn on his shoulders, as Lynn once described. She found herself smiling, picturing that young Henry, forging a bond he would never speak of again. That bond now had a second life. As evening drew close, Joyce strolled through the park, letting the cool breeze wash over her. She glanced back at the gathering. Lynn laughing with Elaine, their children mingling, Olivia translating for someone. felt surreal yet right. A warmth bloomed in Joyce's chest, a sense that Henry's silent wish, for Lynn to be known and loved, had finally come true. In the days following the memorial, Joyce framed the original photo of Henry, the one with the tattoo so clearly visible. She placed it on the mantel, no longer ashamed or hurt by what it represented. Beside it, she displayed Lynn's picture and a new family photo from the memorial, showing all of them together. In that photo, Elaine and Lynn stood side by side, each with an arm around the other's waist, both smiling with the tentative joy of a newly discovered siblinghood. It was the portrait Henry would never see, but she hoped somehow he knew. Joyce settled into a new normal. She carried Henry's memory with a bittersweet fondness, realizing she understood him better in death than she ever had while he was alive. She recognized that her husband had been shaped not just by the experiences he'd shared, but also by the burdens he kept secret. They all had secrets, she supposed. That was part of being human. When she couldn't sleep, she sometimes wandered to the mantel, studying the photographs. She thought of the countless other families forever changed by the Vietnam War, the hidden children, the lost loves, the diaspora spread across continents. Henry's story was just one thread in a vast tapestry. Yet for Joyce, it was a deeply personal thread, one that had redefined her sense of family, making it both larger and more complicated than she ever imagined. Elaine had her own processing to do. She confided in Joyce that sometimes she struggled with the idea of her father loving someone else so intensely before her mother. But then she admitted that she found a certain solace in knowing he had been capable of that kind of love in the chaos of war. "Dad was always so quiet about Vietnam," Elaine said one afternoon, while helping Joyce organize the house. "I guess now I see why. It wasn't something he could tuck neatly away. He probably felt guilty every single day." Joyce nodded. "I think so. I just wish he'd felt safe enough to tell us. But I'm learning that some pains run so deep, words aren't enough." They finished packing away some of Henry's old keepsakes into a cedar chest. Joyce kept the footlocker and its contents mostly intact, though. She considered it a living archive of Henry's life, a place where Lynn and Elaine might discover more about him in the future. Sometimes, she liked to reread the letter Henry wrote but never sent. "Lynn, I tried to find you. They said you were gone. Every day I wish I'd stayed." She would picture him writing those words, tears perhaps in his eyes, heartbreak weighing on his soul. The tragedies of war had cut short a romance, severed a father-daughter bond, and set Henry on a path where silence seemed safer than truth. Yet, in a strange twist, his death and Joyce's determination had reversed that fate. The truths he never voiced were now out in the open, forging connections across an ocean of misunderstanding. Joyce felt no small measure of pride in having shepherded that process. It gave her renewed purpose. Before Henry's passing, Joyce's life had revolved around everyday routines: grocery shopping, garden club, occasional family visits, dinners with Henry, quiet evenings reading. Now, her days were frequently filled with phone calls or video chats with Lynn's family. She learned about Vietnamese culture, tasted new dishes, and even tried to pick up a few phrases of the language with Olivia's help. She felt a spark of vitality that she hadn't experienced in years. As if Henry's silent legacy had opened a new chapter not just for Elaine but for Joyce as well. The final loose ends involved adjusting Henry's estate. Joyce discovered that the life insurance and retirement benefits all named her and Elaine, of course. But she wondered if Lynn deserved something too. The question was delicate. Would Lynn even want it? Or would it feel like a token from a man who never acknowledged her during his lifetime? She broached the subject with Lynn, who was touched but politely declined any official claim. Instead, she asked that they create a scholarship fund in Henry's name for Vietnamese Americans seeking higher education. It was a way to give back, to honor the circumstances that led to her existence. Joyce thought it was a beautiful idea. She and Elaine contributed seed money, and soon the Henry T. Morrison Memorial Scholarship was established. Felt like the right tribute. Time passed. Seasons shifted. The rawness of Henry's death and the shock of the secret softened into a gentle acceptance. Joyce visited Fresno a few more times, forging a bond with Lynn's children, Henry's grandchildren, after all. During one trip, Lynn's daughter might introduce Joyce to a neighbor who had also been separated from family during the war. The neighbor teared up hearing the story, saying it reminded her of so many untold tales. Joyce felt a surge of empathy for all those who carried such heavy burdens in silence. As the first anniversary of Henry's passing approached, Elaine suggested they hold a small gathering at the house, inviting Lynn and her family. Joyce agreed. They called it a remembrance ceremony, a chance for everyone to speak about Henry openly. The day arrived with crisp autumn air. The leaves in the yard were turning golden and red. Joyce set up folding chairs under a large oak tree. She displayed the pictures again, Henry's younger self, the images from Vietnam, the new family portraits. People took turns standing and sharing memories. Elaine spoke of Henry teaching her to ride a bike. Lynn recounted a faint recollection of him lifting her onto his shoulders, though she admitted it might have been pieced together from her mother's stories. Mai read a short poem in Vietnamese about lost fathers. Olivia stood and explained how she'd helped with translations, feeling proud to have played a role in reuniting a family. Finally, Joyce stood. She cradled the letter Henry wrote but never sent. Henry was many things: my husband, Elaine's father, Lynn's father, a soldier, a quiet man who carried secrets to protect those he loved. I used to be angry at him for that, but I've come to realize he did the best he could. He never forgot Lynn. He just didn't know how to bring that part of his life into ours. I wish I could tell him now that it's okay, that we understand, that we love him, and we love each other because of him. When she finished, tears glistened in the eyes of those gathered. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, and the hush felt almost sacred. They stood together for a while, letting the weight of the words and the unity sink in. Then, slowly, they returned to the house for a simple meal, the mood somber but also comforting. They were a family, bound by Henry's memory. Night fell, and Lynn's family prepared to leave for their hotel. Joyce walked them to the door. Lynn turned to her, hesitating, then embraced her tightly. "Thank you," Lynn whispered, "for letting me see him through your eyes." Joyce squeezed Lynn's hand. "And thank you for loving him, for helping me see who he was before we met. He was your father, too." Elaine joined the hug, a quiet affirmation that the bond between them was real. It wouldn't always be easy. They lived far apart, had different life experiences, and had been shaped by different cultures. But they had Henry in common, his memory, his love, and now the willingness to share both sadness and joy. At some point that night, Joyce found herself alone again in the living room, the echo of voices fading. She stared at the photos, the new family portrait with everyone smiling despite the complicated history that had brought them to that moment. She realized that, in searching for Henry's secret, she had found more than she ever anticipated. She had discovered resilience, love that spanned continents, and a sense of hope. Henry's silence had once felt like a betrayal, but now she understood it as the burden of a man who had faced unimaginable heartbreak, caught between duty to his homeland and devotion to a family he could never truly reach again. The next morning, she woke with a sense of calm. The house felt lighter, as though the secrets once hidden in the attic were now replaced by the gentle hum of acceptance. She made coffee, opened the windows to let in fresh air, and thought about her plan for the day. She would drive Lynn and Mai to the local cemetery, so they could see Henry's grave before heading back to Fresno. Elaine had suggested placing a small Vietnamese flag next to his tombstone, a silent nod to the heritage he had carried with him, even if he never spoke of it. They arrived at the cemetery that afternoon. Lynn stood before the granite marker bearing Henry's name. Joyce watched as Lynn knelt, placed a small bouquet of white lilies, then murmured a few words in Vietnamese. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but her expression was one of gentle sorrow, not anger. Mai joined her, resting a hand on Lynn's shoulder, and together they offered a short prayer. Elaine stood behind them, tears brimming in her own eyes. Joyce felt her heart squeeze, but also felt an odd gratitude for being present to witness this moment. One Henry never could have imagined, yet might have desperately hoped for in some corner of his heart. When they finished, Elaine reached into her purse and brought out a small wooden sign with Henry's army photo printed on it. She pushed it into the grass near the headstone. "So people know who he was," she explained quietly. "All of him." They stood in silence for a while, letting the moment settle. A breeze picked up, carrying the faint scent of the lilies. Joyce thought of the memorial scholarship, the gatherings, the new connections. Henry was gone, but his legacy was alive in both of his daughters, and in the families they were building together. It might not erase the decades of separation, but it offered a kind of healing. That evening, Lynn and I departed, hugging Joyce and Elaine goodbye. The following days were subdued, but Joyce felt a lingering sense of closure she had not thought possible. She dedicated more time to volunteering at the local cultural center, helping newcomers integrate. She and Elaine planned a trip to Vietnam, inspired by Lynn's stories, hoping to visit the places Henry had once walked. Lynn agreed to accompany them as a guide, bridging yet another gap between the past and present. At last, on a quiet afternoon, Joyce walked through the attic once again. She opened the footlocker carefully. The uniform, the medals, the letters, she laid them all out. There was a time when handling these items felt like an intrusion on Henry's privacy, but now it felt like honoring him completely. She pictured him as a young soldier, falling in love with Lynn's mother amidst the turbulence of war. She pictured him older, returning home to eventually marry her, building a life but never forgetting the daughter he left behind. She whispered a soft goodbye to him, allowing her tears to flow in gentle acceptance. The days grew into weeks, the weeks into months, and soon the second anniversary of Henry's death approached. A sense of peace had taken root in Joyce's life. She missed Henry daily, but she no longer felt the gnawing anger or the unresolved confusion. She had found her own strength in the process of uncovering his secret. Rather than tearing them apart, it had woven them together. Joyce, Elaine, and Lynn, each carrying Henry's memory into the future. For the second anniversary, they organized a simple gathering at the house again, this time with more extended family, more friends, and a hint of celebration in the air. Children ran across the yard, squealing and giggling. Elaine and Lynn joked about looking so alike in certain photos. The house was filled with the aroma of both traditional American home-cooked meals and Vietnamese specialties. It was, in essence, the unity Henry had once dreamed of, though he hadn't found the words to make it real himself. Near the end of the gathering, Joyce stood in the doorway, watching as Lynn and Elaine said goodbye to some relatives. Her heart felt full. She marveled at how a single photograph in an attic had led to all of this, a transformation none of them could have predicted. She felt Henry's presence in the laughter, the warmth, the shared tears that had ultimately brought them all closer. Later that night, after everyone had gone, Joyce sat alone in the living room, a mug of tea in her hands. She gazed at the photographs on the mantel. Henry's uncropped tattoo photo, Lynn's childhood picture, and the big family portrait. She smiled softly, remembering how lost she had felt when she first unearthed that envelope. She never would have guessed that such a painful discovery could yield so much healing. In that moment, she understood that the greatest gift Henry ever gave her was not just their life together, but the chance to discover the part of him he never could share. In bridging that gap, she had allowed love to fill the space that once housed secrets and regret. And she knew, beyond doubt, that wherever Henry was, he would have been deeply grateful. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already, and subscribe for more.